Paul Magdalino is an emeritus professor from the University of St. Andrews in the UK. And the book that we'll be talking about today is called Roman Constantinople in Byzantine Perspective. Right? So this is kind of how later here Byzantine inhabitants of the city wrote about and reconfigured and praised and talked about their city, especially its earlier phases. So what are labeled here, Roman Constantinople. And the subtitle is interesting, and we'll be talking about some of its key words, the memorial and aesthetic rediscovery of Constantine's beautiful city from late antiquity to the Renaissance. So without further delay, here is my conversation with Paul. We're in a little bit of a sort of Constantinople renaissance when it comes to studies and books. I know John Matthews just published his book on the earliest phase. It just came out a few weeks ago, and I'm looking forward to reading that. And I think we're all expecting Cyril Mango's posthumous volume to appear in some time.
Yeah.
So I was also very happy to read your book, which takes an interesting approach. This is what the residents of the city, especially later on, made of this wonderful tradition of monuments and history that they had inherited. I mean, we're talking about a city that was a capital for over 1,000 years. So one thing that's striking about the documentary record that we have is that we have so few accounts of the foundation of Constantinople, like in the 320s
Hmm.
and 330. We just kind of have a little few hints at first, and we only get narratives later in the 5th century.
Hmm.
So can you tell us briefly about these initial narratives? Some are pagan, some are Christian. Why do you focus in the book more on the pagan narrative?
Yeah, well, I classify the narratives into Christian and pagan for the sake of clarity and emphasis, although the distinction is not entirely clear-cut. The Christian narratives are aggressively Christian, but the pagan narratives are pagan by their omission of Christian elements. Among the Christian narratives, one must distinguish between the short passages in the biography of Constantine by his contemporary Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, and the equally short passages in the histories of the Universal Church, written 100 years later or more by Sozomen and Socrates. However, all these authors evoke Constantine's church buildings in general, giving one or two examples, but never going into detail. The non-Christian narratives also appear to be quite random. One, Malalas, mentions the pagan temples that Constantine left standing, but another, Zosimus, mentions temples that the emperor actually built. But what must be emphasized is that the four major surviving 5th and 6th century accounts of the foundation, whether Christian or pagan, are all just passages in larger historical works, not dedicated to Constantinople. Why do I focus more on the pagan narrative? I find it more interesting because it is more of a challenge to reconstruct, being more elusive, possibly due to the censorship that it underwent under the Emperor Justinian, a bit of a fanatic and therefore uncongenial to me. The pagan narrative also is intriguing because it seems to represent a conscious rediscovery of Constantinople by the intellectuals who had come to identify with the city. And it seems to have been the curiosity of these intellectuals that produced the first dedicated account of the origins of the city that we know about, although it has not survived. This is the Patria of Constantinople, 12 books of hexameter verse, by the poet Christodoros of Koptos.
So you reconstruct what might have been the kind of Ur-pagan narrative from the different sources that seem to reflect it. What's interesting about this tradition is that it appears in its fuller forms later on, sort of like around 500 or after that. Why does it come along so much later? Or is that just when the sources for it are preserved? Because there's a kind of tension here between an original tradition that may have come out of the 4th century versus an interpretation of the city, especially after the fall of the Western Empire, um,
Mhm, mhm.
around 500. Yeah, talk a little bit about the chronology of the appearance of this pagan narrative.
Yeah, well, as you say, there may have been something in the 4th century, and one is tempted to think that Julian might have sponsored something. But it's around the 500 that the political and cultural elite of Constantinople seem to have felt the need to rediscover and advertise the city's pre-Christian and to some extent pre-Roman roots in the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, which Constantine had refounded and transformed into a Roman and predominantly Christian imperial capital. One can discern several factors which favored the articulation of this perception at this time. Firstly, the abolition in 476, you just mentioned it, of the Roman Empire in the West, and the extinction of Rome as an imperial capital, which must have led to the formulation of the idea that Constantinople was predestined to take its place. By then, there's nostalgia for the pagan past, which was in the process of being erased, perhaps a desire to give Constantinople a Greek as well as a Roman identity. Most of the educated elite who ran the imperial administration were from Greek-speaking cities in the eastern provinces of the empire. There's a sense, I think, that Constantinople needed a traditional and therefore pagan cultural heritage to put it on a par with the other great cultural centers of the Greek East, Antioch, Alexandria, Athens, along with a host of lesser but very ancient cities. Leading intellectuals from other cities in the 4th century, Libanius, Samianus, and others, had looked down on Constantinople as an upstart Novo-Riche intruder. The emperor at the turn of the 6th century, Anastasius I, was exceptionally friendly to traditional civic culture. He came from a traditional city, Dyrrhachium, and he's praised by Procopius of Gaza as being very well disposed to the cities. There was a general vogue among the cities of the Greek East around this time for the rediscovery of their pagan past and cultural heritage. We can see this most strikingly in the work of an Egyptian poet, Christodhoros of Koptos, as recorded in a biographical notice in a 10th century classical dictionary. There he is said to have written patria, that is, mythological and historical narratives of a city's origins and early history, of 5 cities, including Constantinople. We have no idea what this text, which consisted of 12 books in epic verse, contained. It presumably told the story of Byzantium from its mythical origins to its refoundation by Constantine. It may also have presented republican and imperial Rome as the prelude to the creation of Constantinople as a new Rome. But it must have provided the outline of the pagan narrative, which has left traces in other sources, and it was probably the first composition that put the narrative together. It must also have conformed, with due allowance for the exceptional character of Constantinople, to the generic pattern of the other patrian narratives that Theodoros composed. In other words, it presented Constantinople as a model ancient Greek polis under Roman rule. I think it's important to emphasize that the patria composition of Christodhoros of Koptos are the last burst of the genre, which pops up throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, but disappears entirely after the reign of Anastasius. Also significant, I think, is the fact that no patria text survives intact in its original form. I cannot help but connect these disappearances to the ideological repression that set in with the accession to power of Justin I and Justinian.
I'm always intrigued by references to Julian. There's a problem with Julian is that everyone wants to attribute everything to him all the time. However, in this case, and this is not well known about Julian, but I think he is the first person we know who was born in Constantinople.
Yeah.
Just like a year after its foundation. Obviously, other people were probably born within that year, but he's the first one we know. And he didn't hide the fact, I mean, that he was born there. I mean, it was his city, and he treated it that way. So I wouldn't be surprised if he or just his reign played some sort of role there. So moving to the big picture trajectory of the book, you kind of sketch a transition from a more sort of memorial to a more aesthetic mode of writing about the city. So how do you understand these two modes, and can you give us an example of each one?
Well, I introduce and probably invent the schematic distinction in order to make sense of what seem to me to be 2 distinct ways of looking at the urban environment that do not generally appear together in the same writings. One looks for identities and meanings, the other looks at appearances and impressions. They correspond to the different literary genre in which cities and buildings were celebrated in late antiquity. On the one hand, chronicles and patria texts. On the other hand, the rhetoric of praise, encomium, and description, ekphrasis. Unfortunately, the patchy survival of the relevant texts from antique Constantinople does not allow for clear comparison. But when we get into the Middle Ages, the contrast is striking. Between the so-called patriographic texts of the 7th to 10th century, which tell stories about monuments but never comment on their artistic quality, and those of the 10th to 15th centuries, where the overriding concern is with kalos, beauty, and megathos, size. Contrast the notices on statues in the 8th century parastasis with the so-called De Signis of Nikitas Choniatis in the early 13th century, or take the two longest medieval texts on Constantinople, the so-called Patria of Constantinople from the end of the 10th century, where beauty and dimensions are never a concern, and the Byzantios of Theodoros Metochites in the early 14th century, where kalos and megathos are all over the place.
Right. Yeah, these are very different genres. One of the interesting things about your study is that you talk about different genres of literature, and it's difficult in this medium sort of podcast to do close readings, which is what you do in the text. You look at these either descriptions or antiquarian research or orations like Metochites in the way that's appropriate to each one. It's difficult to do here, especially so our audience can't read the text or look at it or read long quotes and so forth. So what I'd like to do is just give the audience a taste of some of the different views that emerged during this millennium and the different modes in which authors wrote about it. So one mode I'd like to pick out, which is always interesting, are prophecies of the city's own demise. So Constantinople, like throughout its history, was always accompanied by this sense of doom, and prophecies were discovered in all kinds of different media, from horoscopes to monuments and so on. Can you give us some sense of the text in which these prophecies appear, and why was this? Why was Constantinople so kind of obsessed with the fear of its own demise?
Just to start with that point, it's a big and important city. And like Rome, I mean, it's very, very conscious of its own importance and worried about, yeah, how long it's going to keep that importance. Talking about prophecies and where they pop up. I mean, they're prophecies, oracles, and omens are part of the furniture in ancient and medieval narrative writing, and they frequently serve as narrative devices or attention grabbers. We can be sure that the Patria of Christodorus was full of oracles, and I think that some of the oracles that are recorded by Malalas, for example, or the Tübingen Theosophy, were used by Christodorus. But prophecies concerning the fate of Constantinople are meant very seriously, because Constantinople is literally of cosmic significance as the notional capital of the world, and in this it takes over the world of Rome in Jewish and early Christian apocalyptic prophecy. Thus, just as Rome, in the guise of Babylon the Great, is threatened with submersion by the sea in the Apocalypse of St. John, so a frenzied prophetess in the mid-6th century has a vision of Constantinople being engulfed by the sea. This is in the Chronicle of Malalas. 4 centuries later, the eponymous hero of the life of St. Andreas Salos, Andrew the Fool, predicts that the city will be hurled like a millstone into the sea. And I think this ultimately goes back to Revelation, the Apocalypse.
I like the juxtaposition in the 6th century of the city being submerged by the sea, but also that image in Procopius where Justinian drinks up all the sea and it's all gone.
Yep.
I mean, the sea was all around them, so it was good to think with. Tell us about the historiated columns as prophetic narratives. And by the way, just for the sake of the audience, we mean these imperial columns like the ones that survive in Rome of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius that depict scenes, usually of a campaign or war of that emperor. So there were a few of those in Constantinople too. So how were they read along these lines?
Yeah, we're talking about the column of Theodosius in the Forum that he laid out, and that of his son Arcadius in the Forum named after him. And yeah, these columns are interesting in their own right as more or less imitations of those two columns in Rome, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. And what's intriguing for us, what was especially intriguing for ancient and medieval people, was that they had these spiral friezes. with what were clearly narratives of wars and movements of armies and so on, and crowds, a lot of crowd scenes. I mean, they're like strip cartoons. Together
Yeah.
with their richly carved bases, these columns lent themselves to interpretation as visual predictions of future events. And their depictions of military figures with outlandish clothes and hairstyles fed into anxiety that the city would be taken by barbarians.
Yeah, there's specific moments we know from historical texts where people would look at the images there and link them to events going on all around them and predicting, that some enemy at the gates would take the city or something like that. I find the sheer distance in time between when these columns were made and when they're being read in this manner by the city's inhabitants to be just absolutely fascinating. It's just hard to wrap your mind around it. Like it is 1,000 years sometimes. And
Yeah.
the whole city was full of these ancient monuments, and some of them must have been in ruin. They certainly had to be. There are some of them that I tried to track. So there's this big fire, and the sources say such and such a building was destroyed. For example, the Senate House in the form of Constantine. And I tried to find out if it was ever repaired fully. And I yet couldn't get confirmation of that, nor that it was ever used if for the purpose
Mhm,
for which it
mhm,
was, right?
mhm, mhm.
So there's a possibility that some of these buildings were maybe the facade was preserved, but the inside was kind of a burned out shell. It's just anyway, but it's difficult to imagine, but surely many of these buildings must have been in a pretty bad shape, especially after the seventh century. You talk in the book sometimes about the haunting effect that these old monuments have. Can you give us some examples of how later Constantinopolitans engaged with these hauntings of their own past?
Yeah, well, I use the word haunting obviously because it creates the atmosphere. But I think old monuments could be haunting in two senses. When they were utterly lost, the evocation of their memory and the empty spaces they left could fire
Mm,
the imagination, like bomb sites in European cities after World War II. And there are several cases of disappeared statues in the 8th century parastasis. But standing monuments could be haunting in a more literal sense because they were actually haunted by elemental spirits known as stihia. And they were said to be bewitched by experts in this kind of thing, stihumena.
yes.
So, yes, I think that this was a haunted environment.
And by the 14th century, they're talking about the Metochites, whom we'll get to. He was talking about the ruins as something that adds to the luster of the city, that even the ruins add to the city's beauty.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
It kind of anticipates this sort of romantic views of ruins in the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Before we get to Metochites, who's sort of late in the story, there's another topic I'd like to discuss, which is the occasional mention of tour guides, tourists, and guidebooks that comes up in your book periodically. You mention them a few places. Can you give us some insight into how Constantinople may have been kind of packaged for tourist or visitor consumption? Sort of stories that circulated precisely in order to be told to visitors, whether political or pilgrims.
We have practically no information on any of these people, the guides, the tourists, and the guidebooks. Well, we can guess that one surviving text in a later recension was a guidebook, but it doesn't function particularly well as a guidebook when you just read it neat. So just about everything I write in the book is based on this subject, based on inference and conjecture. We can only assume that visitors were numerous, that guides were always in demand, and that much of the information they conveyed was written down at some point in its circulation. I tend to think that the collection of notices on monuments, the parastasis and the patria, which I've just mentioned, that they represent snapshot moments in an endless recycling process of
Mm.
information, or as I meant to say, call it in the book, sometimes disinformation. I think we can say with some confidence that pilgrims visiting the churches were both more numerous and better served in all ways than mere tourists who just stuck to the public monuments, as must have been the case with the non-Christian visitors.
When I say guidebooks, I'm not thinking of something that would look exactly like a modern guidebook. Certainly nothing that would have practical information about like, getting by, on, five foles or less per day. But I think that some of these texts functioned as repositories of stories to tell visitors. I sometimes think of the narrative of the construction of Hagia Sophia that way. Hagia Sophia was probably the single most visited building. And I think that its staff, which numbered in the hundreds, I think some of them, their job must have been to show people around and tell them stories. And I think these texts were just a useful compendium of that kind of storytelling that they needed. But that's just guesswork, really, on my
Yeah,
part.
and then there are collections of miracle accounts from other churches,
Yes,
and they must have been written up by members of the clergy of the church or the lay confraternities,
right.
which were associated with those
Mm.
churches. We know something about them, and members of the confraternities, probably members of the confraternities, would have acted as guides, but we're in the dark, but we're a little better informed about the upper level of the tourist. Uh,
Yes. Tell us about that. So this is specifically imperial use of the city to impress visitors, sort of show them
yeah,
around.
yeah.
Yeah, how were like imperial relics and monuments used by the court in this way?
The intention of these tours was evidently threefold. Firstly, it's to wow the visitors with the stupendous architecture of buildings like Hagia Sophia and the Hippodrome. Is secondly to transport them out of themselves by the total experience of the performances that went on in these buildings, the games in the Hippodrome, the liturgy in Hagia Sophia, and of course we have visitors' reactions to the liturgy in Hagia Sophia that
Hmm.
supposedly is what induced the Vladimir of Kiev to convert to Christianity, the report from his envoys. There's an intention to disarm and awe the Christian visitors by giving them a confidential view of the inner sanctum of empire, that is, the chapels and chambers of the imperial palace, and to show them objects connected with the first emperors of Constantinople, of course, were Roman emperors recognized in the West.
Yeah, there's probably no more impressive stage for the performance of political power than that in this period, maybe apart from Baghdad. So, turning to another topic, why are there so few direct sort of panegyrics of the city from most of this period when the city is in fact praised in superlative terms in other texts, but in terms of a dedicated speech or text praising Constantinople, we really have to wait until the end. I mean, for Metochites, really. Why do you think that happened?
Perhaps you should turn the question around and ask whether before the 12th, the 13th century, there was any reason for an orator to praise the city independently of the figure, usually the emperor, or the institution which it was in his interest to celebrate. In fact, the literary works which are entirely and uniquely devoted to the praise of Constantinople remain very few, even in the late period. It's true, nevertheless, that the volume of literature in praise of Constantinople increases after 1261. That is, speeches which may have another object, but which where the praise of Constantinople is extended. And I think this is due to the fact that in the late period, it's due to the fact that Constantinople had been lost in 1204 and then regained in 1261 and its inhabitants had come to look at it with new eyes. They'd learned not to take it for granted. They'd also seen that it was not irreplaceable as a national capital. But actually, the habit of writing city panegyrics revives in the 13th century, not in Constantinople. It's actually it first attested in Nicaea, in the Empire of Nicaea, where Nicaea is praised in encomium by Theodore Lascaris, the last
Hmm.
ruler of that state in exile.
Your discussion of the panegyrics, it actually got me thinking that why do we not have panegyrics of Constantinople? It would seem to be the most obvious topic. But in reality, panegyrics of cities, for example, in the Roman second century, which is one of the sort of high points of these kinds of texts, they take place in a context of intense competition among the different cities, say, of Asia Minor and Greece and so on. And so those panegyrics play that role because they're competitive works. Each city has to make its claim heard over the, general buzz of people praising their cities. And it's the same for emperors, if you think about it. Emperors are praised because there's always alternatives. There was the emperor before, there's the emperor after, there's possible rivals. Emperors need to be praised because people can imagine alternatives to them. But Constantinople, for most of this period, it's so preeminent that there's no actual, I mean, like you said, there's no actual political dividend to be gained by praising it. In fact, you might even diminish it by making it look like a run-of-the-mill kind of city that needs to be praised, like you're protesting too much or something like that. But exactly as you said, in the later period, once they lose Constantinople for 50 years, they realize, whoa, wait, there are alternatives. Like we cannot have it for one thing. And so the idea of praising both the alternatives like Nicaea that they occupied for a while, but then Constantinople again when they get it back I think
Hmm.
it's because of this kind of insecurity. It's no longer taken for granted or just sort of obvious. So let's talk about the person who produced the first sort of really monumental oration in praise of Constantinople, and this is Theodoros Metochites. Can you tell us a little bit about who he is first?
Well, he's the leading political and intellectual figure, as well as the richest individual in Byzantium, for the greater part of the reign of the Emperor Andronicus II Palaeologos, who was on the throne from 1282 to 1328. Metochites controlled the government from 1305 to 1328, and he married into the imperial family. He was immensely learned and had a big library. He wrote an enormous amount, in addition to three very long orations, including the Byzantios, the speech in praise of Constantinople. He wrote speeches in praise of the emperor, a number of poems, a treatise on astronomy, and a large number of essays which offer philosophical reflections, some of them quite original, on a variety of subjects. Modern scholars have been especially interested in these essays where he reflects on ancient Greece and Rome and on the decline of the empire in his own day. Metochites also lovingly restored one of the largest and oldest monasteries in the city, that of Christ the Saviour in Kora, where he arranged to be buried. The restored monastery church still stands in Istanbul as the Carrier Mosque. And one can still admire, or at least one could before the building was reconverted from a museum back into a mosque, the mosaic cycles with which Metochites decorated the western galleries, that is, the narthex and the exonarthex, and the frescoes with which he decorated his funerary chapel on the south side of the church. The mosaics include a portrait of him over the main entrance, one of the best-known portraits surviving from Byzantium.
And I should add that Metochites was the teacher of my author, the one I'm translating now, Nikiforos Grigoras, who kind of inherited his mantle as an intellectual, though not as a politician. And in his history, in the first volume, which I translated last year, Grigoras provides a number of episodes from Metochites' domestic life where he was present with his family, or how he reacted to events of the time, the civil wars in the 20s, that's the 1320s. I feel that my work on Grigoras is always kind of intimately connected to Metochites in some way or another. I think Grigoras often will use kind of turns of phrase and expressions that Metochites used. And I just came across a reference to Constantinople, which it's just two sentences long, but I think it's a kind of summary of Metochites' oration, the Byzantios. So let's turn to that text. Can you tell us what is most striking or unique about this text?
Striking is its great length, which can only be described as monumental. And this is in keeping with the text's repeated insistence on the grandeur, the megathos, and the beauty, the kalos, of the city it's describing. The Xanthias effectively does for Constantinople what famous oration of the 4th century, the Antiochikos, of Libanius had done for Antioch almost 1,000 years earlier. To me, that's it's the Byzantios is a deliberate throwback to a genre that had not been practiced and had
Hmm.
not, funnily enough, been practiced for Constantinople, even at the time of its foundation. Antiochos could be seen too as a reaction to the foundation of Constantinople.
Yes,
And
yes. When we get Constantinople, we don't get an oration for Constantinople. We get an oration for Antioch.
Mhm, mhm,
That's
right.
right.
The Byzantius the speech makes a passing reference to the ruling emperor and praises the patriarchate as an institution, but otherwise it mentions no authority figure apart from the city's founder, the Emperor Constantine the Great. Its most original contribution to literature, and probably its main purpose, is to praise Constantinople as the perfect urban environment, in which it is possible for the intellectual to enjoy an ideal existence, balanced between pure contemplation and busy public activity. And Metochites is, of course, thinking of his own double life as a statesman and as a scholar stroke a writer.
And it's also a difficult text to read,
Yes.
right?
Well,
Yeah.
that's yeah. I mean, its vocabulary is not that daunting, but the sentence structure,
Yes.
indeed.
The
Yeah,
sentence structure and sometimes the elusiveness of it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he uses some abstract terms, and you're always wondering, is he referring to something specific here, or is this an abstract quality? It's long and difficult. And I don't think we have a published English translation. I think there's one in a dissertation. Yeah, there's a Greek translation, which I sometimes consult. Anyway,
Well, Polemius Greek translation.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
It's very helpful because sometimes you just need someone else's eyes on it.
Mhm.
Now, you mentioned in your analysis of this text that Metochites did research. You used the word research or, reading in preparation
Yeah.
for it. Yeah, what kind of research did he do?
Well, I should just in parenthesis say that I mentioned research a lot in this because the series in which the book is published is called Research Perspectives on Byzantium.
Yes.
And so I felt I had to somehow work this in as much as I could, taking a rather unorthodox line to look at what research the Byzantines did on Constantinople and not just what Western scholars have done.
No, I thought that was very interesting. And there's a place in the book that I particularly appreciated because so there's this instinctive association that Western scholars feel with other earlier Western scholars writing on the city, like Pierre Gillius and so forth. And I remember this, I think it was in Mango somewhere, where he refers to these Western visitors as we, like they're in a tradition that includes us.
Hmm.
And that whatever the Greek-speaking inhabitants of the city, both in these times, but also in Ottoman times, that's them. They're the
Yeah, yeah,
object,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we're the subject. And I,
Yeah,
I
well,
really like that you break that link and
we can
that
come to that at the yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But Metochites did have he had models, right? And you mentioned the Antiochikos and Elias Aristides and so forth. Um,
Yeah, I think what you just said, his elusiveness. I mean, this is part of the game, part of the effect, not to be too explicit about anything, especially his sources. Actually, I think it unlikely that he went out of his way to research the writing of this oration. That is, he didn't read anything that he wouldn't have read anyway as part of his classical education and his general culture, which would have included all literature on Constantinople. I see the Byzantios as growing out of his reading rather than the other way around. However, I do see signs that when writing it, he made a point of reading up on the history of the Church of Constantinople and the local cult of the Virgin Mary. These were interests being developed at exactly the same time by his friend Nikiforos Xanthopoulos, with whom he was in close touch.
hmm. Metochites was so learned. I think Ligoras calls him a walking library at some point.
A living
That
library.
yes, that anything he wrote would have been the result of some sort of research, and the Hora was endowed with what we can really call a research library. I mean, many scholars today are busy identifying books that passed through that library at some point or
Hmm.
another by identifying the scribal hands of people who made notes in them. And Grigoras is one of those. He scribbled in the margins of many classical and later authors. So it's a fascinating sort of literary milieu associated with that monastery and its library. Speaking of which, what does Metochites mean that Constantinople is the common theater of the whole world?
Theatre is an image that Metochites loves to use, and I think not least because it describes what he's doing in the rhetorical performance of this oration. It's an image with deep roots in Byzantine literature, especially literature concerning Constantinople of the 12th and 13th centuries. Metochites brings it in whenever he can, and he uses it in multiple senses. Constantinople is the common theatre of the whole world, yes, because there one can be a spectator to the whole range of humanity that passes through. But Constantinople itself is also an actor on the world stage, just as Constantine had been an actor on the world stage when he founded the city.
I try to make that case in historical terms in the first chapter. So I'm writing a new history of 1453, the siege and fall of Constantinople. Uh, in part because I realized that the most recent one that we have was Runciman from 1965. And I'm talking about a narrative that uses the sources, not like studies like what Walter and Marius did. And I tried to explain how, even in the early 15th century, a resident of Constantinople could imagine the city as the kind of center of its own, not an empire that it controls anymore, obviously, but of a sort of extended world that is focused on it in some way. And I
Mhm,
think it
mhm.
was still possible to believe that. And yet you say, and this is a good point on which to close. You say that Metochites in some ways liberates Constantinople. Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
I think he liberates it from the associations that it commonly has in Byzantine literature, and most of all, the association with imperial power. He simply doesn't mention the palace.
Yes.
He refers
Yeah.
briefly to the ruling Emperor Andronicus II, but then doesn't mention emperors thereafter, apart from Constantine. But Constantine is just the one who sets the ball rolling.
You're exactly right. I mean, he liberates it from the heavy weight of the imperial tradition that had always been housed there, right? But I also get the sense that he sort of liberates it from its own history, and even specifically from the history that it was living through in the 14th century, which was not a happy one,
No,
but it's a kind of ideal place whose value is undiminished by what was happening, all these famines and mercenary armies and the Genoese right across the Golden Horn and to come the plague and things like that. It kind of retains its timeless beauty regardless of the accidents of history.
and well, I mean, he liberates it from the weight of empire. I mean, that is not just the court, but also the provinces and the armies in the provinces. None of this hinges
Yeah.
on the Constantinople he describes. And I mean, what we get is a city, religious city, and he does lay great emphasis on orthodoxy and the church and the orthodoxy of the Byzantine Church of the Church of Constantinople compared with others. And also, I don't think that he mentions monasticism or monasteries. He
Right.
churches, but not monasteries, or the monastic life. And of course, the life that he idealizes is the life of living in the city, in the midst of the city, looking at the hustle and bustle of the city.
He does praise scholarship, though. I mean,
Yeah.
logi, right? So, which for him was associated with the monastery. But you're right, he doesn't actually make that connection. He's interested in paideia as a kind of ideal and learning and scholarship, but not the specific places where it was housed. I think that's a great place on which to bring this to a close. The interested, listeners can obviously go read the book. It's not that long. It's very accessible and actually fun to read. You actually put some humor in there too, which I appreciated. What's next for you? Can you give us a sense of what you're working on now?
I'm actually turning to a different period, to the late Ottoman period, and to the memoirs of the great uncle of Ruth Macready's.
Oh,
Um,
right.
who was a businessman in the Pontus, had a very eventful life, as he calls it in the title, the memoirs of the adventurous life of Elias Macreades. So I am translating that and researching into the historical background too. I don't seem to get round to it because there are so many other little
Mm.
business chores that I have to
Okay, so
do.
you and I are both doing long translations.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
All right. Paul, it was a great pleasure to speak with you and to read
Thanks
your
very
book.
much for the invitation and the conversation.